Imagine being ripped from your home in the middle of the night, bound in chains, marched for miles with no idea where you were being taken. Imagine being herded into the belly of a ship, crammed so tightly you could barely breathe, surrounded by the cries of men, women, and children who knew they would never see their homeland again. Imagine months at sea, the stench of death everywhere, until finally you are dragged onto a foreign shore, stripped of your name, your language, your family, and even your humanity. This is not fiction. This was reality for more than 12 million Africans during one of the darkest chapters in human history, the Transatlantic Slave Trade. But how did this vast system of human trafficking begin? Why did it last for over 3 centuries? And what impact does it still have on our world today? To answer that, we need to go back to the 15th century, at the edge of a rapidly changing world. Europe was awakening from the Middle Ages. The Renaissance was in full bloom. Wealthy kingdoms like Spain and Portugal were hungry for trade, power, and glory. The Ottoman Empire had blocked the old land routes to Asia, making spices and goods expensive. So Europeans looked to the seas. In their pursuit of gold, land, and new trade routes, they stumbled upon Africa, a continent rich in resources, kingdoms, and people. At first, the Portuguese didn't come looking for slaves. They wanted gold, ivory, and access to Asia. But soon something changed. They noticed that African rulers already practiced forms of slavery. Though slavery in Africa was not the same as what would come later. African slavery often meant prisoners of war, or people who could marry into families or eventually earn freedom. It was not based on race, nor was it always permanent, but Europeans had other ideas. By the late 1400s, Portuguese ships began taking enslaved Africans back to Europe. From Lisbon to Seville, African slaves worked in households, docks, and fields. But this was only the beginning. The real turning point came when Europeans discovered the Americas. Columbus's voyages opened up vast new lands filled with possibilities: sugar in the Caribbean, tobacco in Virginia, silver in Mexico and Peru, and later cotton in the American South. These crops made staggering profits, but they required massive amounts of labor. The native populations of the Americas were devastated by diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza brought by Europeans. Whole communities were wiped out. That left colonists desperate for workers. And so a horrifying solution emerged. Africa would supply the labor. Ships would sail from Europe loaded with weapons, cloth, and manufactured goods. They would trade these for enslaved men, women, and children on the African coast. Then the ships would cross the Atlantic, the dreaded Middle Passage, delivering their human cargo to the Americas. Finally, those same ships would return to Europe loaded with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rum. This became known as the triangular trade, and it made fortunes for merchants, kings, and empires. But the profits came at an unspeakable cost. Imagine the Middle Passage. Africans packed below deck, shackled, unable to move. The air thick with sickness. Food scarce, water contaminated. Some ships carried 400 or more captives, stuffed into spaces smaller than coffins. Mortality rates were staggering. 15 to 20% never survived the journey. Many threw themselves overboard, choosing death over slavery. The Atlantic became a graveyard, swallowing millions of lives. Those who survived faced lives of relentless brutality. In the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the work was so deadly that enslaved Africans rarely lived more than 7 years. Heat, exhaustion, whippings, and disease claimed countless lives. In Brazil, millions were worked to death in sugar and coffee fields. In the American South, enslaved people cultivated cotton and tobacco, feeding the Industrial Revolution. In Europe, families were torn apart at auction blocks. Children sold away from parents, husbands from wives. And yet, amid unimaginable suffering, enslaved Africans resisted. Some fought back violently, leading uprisings and rebellions. Others resisted quietly, breaking tools, feigning illness, preserving African traditions, languages, and music. From Haiti to Virginia, rebellion flickered like fire, impossible to extinguish completely. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the slave trade had grown into a monstrous machine. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands all competed fiercely for dominance. London, Liverpool, and Bristol became rich from the trade. French cities like Nantes and Bordeaux thrived. Entire economies revolved around slavery. At its height, more than 80,000 Africans were shipped across the Atlantic every year. But slavery was never uncontested. In Africa, some rulers resisted selling their people. Others became tragically entangled, trading captives for guns and wealth. In Europe, voices began to question the morality of the trade. Religious groups like the Quakers condemned it. Philosophers of the Enlightenment raised troubling questions about liberty and human rights. And enslaved people themselves never stopped resisting, never stopped reminding the world of their humanity. Yet for centuries, money spoke louder than morality. Plantations poured wealth into European coffers. Sugar sweetened European tea. Cotton clothed entire nations. Tobacco filled pipes. And behind it all was the forced labor of millions who had no choice. But history has a way of shifting. And by the late 18th century, cracks began to appear in this monstrous system. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 sent shockwaves through the world. Enslaved Africans in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up, defeated Napoleon's forces, and declared independence. Haiti became the first free black republic in the Americas, proof that enslaved people could overthrow their masters and demand freedom. Across the Atlantic, abolitionist movements gained strength. In Britain, activists like William Wilberforce and Olaudah Equiano fought tirelessly to end the trade. Equiano, once enslaved himself, wrote a powerful autobiography that revealed the horrors of the Middle Passage to European audiences. The tide was turning. By the early 19th century, Britain outlawed the slave trade, using its navy to patrol the Atlantic and intercept slave ships. Other nations followed, though slavery itself continued. In the United States, the slave trade was banned in 1808, but slavery remained entrenched until the Civil War decades later. In Brazil, slavery lasted until 1888, the last in the Americas to abolish it. But ending slavery on paper did not erase its scars. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade still shapes the modern world, in the African diaspora, in the racial inequalities that persist, in the wealth built on stolen labor, and in the cultural contributions of enslaved peoples who, despite everything, carried their songs, their stories, and their spirit across the ocean. And here is where the story takes a dark twist, because while laws ended the trade, new systems of exploitation emerged: segregation, colonialism, racism, and economic inequality. The struggle for freedom was far from over. What happened next would shape the 19th and 20th centuries, and still echoes today. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade is often told as a story of triumph, of moral awakening, of enlightened leaders finally realizing the cruelty of their ways. But the reality was far more complicated and far more painful. When Britain outlawed the trade in 1807, it wasn't just morality that drove the decision. The Industrial Revolution was rising, and machines were slowly reducing dependence on slave labor. Moreover, Britain had already grown rich from centuries of trade and now wanted to cement its power by controlling others. By policing the seas, Britain could cripple its rivals while claiming the moral high ground. Abolition in many ways became another tool of empire, and yet the trade did not stop overnight. Slave ships continued to sail in secret, often under false flags. Smugglers devised ingenious methods to evade capture. Between 1807 and 1860, more than 3 million Africans were still transported across the Atlantic illegally. Brazil in particular remained a massive destination for enslaved people, with millions more arriving long after the trade was officially abolished. Meanwhile, in the Americas, the fight for true freedom raged on. In the United States, slavery expanded in the early 19th century thanks to the cotton gin. Cotton became white gold, fueling factories in Britain and Europe. By 1860, nearly 4 million African Americans were enslaved in the U.S. The brutal system of plantation slavery defined Southern society, while abolitionists in the North fought desperately to end it. This clash of ideals exploded into the American Civil War, When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it marked a turning point. But even after Union victory, freedom was bitterly contested. The Reconstruction era promised rights and equality, but Jim Crow laws soon replaced slavery with a new form of oppression. The shadow of the slave trade still loomed large. Elsewhere, the story was equally complex. Haiti, the first Black republic, faced relentless isolation and punishment from the world's powers. France demanded crippling reparations, and Western nations shunned Haiti economically. The message was clear. The world feared the example of a successful slave revolt. In the Caribbean, emancipation came slowly, often with conditions that tied freed people to plantations through debt and poverty. In Brazil, slavery dragged on until 1888, longer than anywhere else in the Americas. By then, Brazil had imported more Africans than any other country, leaving a deep cultural and demographic legacy. And what about Africa itself? The continent paid the heaviest price of all. The slave trade robbed Africa of its strongest, youngest generations. Entire regions were depopulated. Societies were destabilized. Kingdoms torn apart by raids and wars fueled by European demand. Economies that might have flourished were instead twisted toward supplying captives. And when the trade finally ended, European powers turned to a new form of exploitation: colonization. Africa was carved up at the Berlin Conference of 1884, with little regard for the people who lived there. The centuries-long wound of slavery was replaced by the scars of empire. Yet despite the devastation, the spirit of those enslaved lived on. Across the Americas, African cultures endured. The rhythms of African drums shaped new music: jazz, blues, samba, reggae. African spiritual traditions blended with Christianity, giving rise to unique religions and practices. Stories and languages, once silenced, found new voice in literature, poetry, and oral traditions. In this way, enslaved Africans reshaped the world, leaving a cultural legacy far beyond the grasp of their oppressors. But here is where the story reaches into our own time. Because the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade are not just in the past. They are here, alive, in the present. The racial inequalities that persist today, the systemic injustices, the economic imbalances between continents, these are not accidents. They are the echoes of centuries of exploitation. Think about it. Europe and the Americas built unimaginable wealth on the backs of enslaved Africans. But the descendants of those enslaved often inherited poverty, discrimination, and exclusion. Even today, debates rage about reparations, about how societies should acknowledge and address this history. Statues are torn down, museums are challenged, textbooks are rewritten. The struggle to come to terms with this past is ongoing, and the haunting question remains: how do you measure the cost of the transatlantic slave trade? Is it the 12 million lives stolen across the ocean? The countless millions more who died in raids, marches, and wars before ever reaching a ship? The families shattered? The cultures destroyed? Or is it in the centuries of inequality that still divide our world? What makes this story even more chilling is how ordinary it seemed to those who built it. Merchants in Liverpool counted profits, without thinking of the human cost. Plantation owners sipped tea sweetened with sugar harvested by hands in chains. Kings signed decrees. Parliaments debated tariffs. Investors bought shares in slave ships, all while millions suffered. It was not a secret. It was not hidden. It was accepted. And perhaps that is the most frightening lesson of all, that an atrocity of this scale could exist, not because people didn't know, but because too many chose not to care. Yet, amid the darkness, there was always resistance. From the very beginning, enslaved Africans fought for freedom. They rebelled on ships. They rose up on plantations. They fled to maroon communities hidden in mountains and forests. They sang songs of defiance, told stories of home, and passed down a spirit of resilience. Their voices may have been silenced by chains, but they were never truly broken. And so, the story of the transatlantic slave trade is not just a story of suffering. It is also a story of survival, of how a people torn from their homeland still managed to shape the modern world with their culture, their strength, and their will to endure. Today, when we speak of freedom, of equality, of human rights, we are echoing the cries of those who endured the Middle Passage, who worked the plantations, who rose up in rebellion. Their struggle is woven into the fabric of our societies, even if we do not always see it. The Transatlantic Slave Trade was one of humanity's darkest chapters. But its lessons are not just about the past, they are warnings for the present. It shows us how greed can blind us, how power can corrupt, and how systems of oppression can be normalized if we let them. But it also shows us the power of resistance, the resilience of culture, and the enduring demand for justice. So when we ask, how did 1/3 of a continent's population vanish into chains? Or, how could entire empires be built on human suffering? We must also ask, what will we do with this knowledge now? Because history is not just about what happened, it's about what happens next.